What's up, everybody? Michael Walsh here. So I want to talk about Islam Makhachev and his potential title defense against Ilia Topuria at 170, and why I think that's, while a very interesting fight, and while a fight I would be hyped for, and it's like a big fight in terms of legacy and in terms of both guys, doing their own thing, chasing GOAT status and whatnot, like, it's still a bullshit title defense at 170. Now, this video was inspired by a guy who commented on one of my last videos, and he asked about the perceived double standard where if Islam defends against Ilia, as I was arguing, and beats him, that's sort of a bullshit title defense. But if Ilia beats Islam, which I'm not picking him to do, but he'd be a live dog in that fight. If Ilia beats him, all of a sudden, would it not be a legitimate title defense? On Islam's part to have taken it. So is there not a bit of a double standard or a bit of a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation where, again, if Islam defends against Ilia and wins, oh, it's a bullshit defense, but should he have lost, then of course it would have been a legitimate defense because Islam was the champion and Ilia was good enough to beat him. And I said to him, yeah, there is a double standard there, but an appropriate one. And so the way it works is it's very analogous to how you'll have title eliminator fights where it's only a title eliminator for one of the people. So we just had that on Saturday. Like Dana White had said that if Sean Brady beat Morales, he would get a title shot, but it wasn't likewise a title eliminator for Morales, that Morales was not guaranteed a title shot with a win. And we'll probably see the same thing this Saturday with Hooker and Arman, where, you never know. If Hooker beats Arman, he might get a title shot, but I kind of doubt it. Whereas if Arman wins, he should get a title shot. And even if he doesn't get the very next title shot, like let's say Ilia fights Patty or something, Arman's next fight, his next fight, should be for the title no matter what. No matter who it's against, even if he's not the very next guy to fight for the title, his next fight should be for the title if he beats Hooker. And I think that's appropriate because the reason that happens in those situations is it's okay, one of you has clearly done enough, either already or will clearly have done enough with this win. And the other guy, whilst a win over the first guy would be very good and would get them much nearer to a title shot, it combined with their collective resume just still wouldn't be enough. At least not enough to guarantee a shot. And I think that's fair, and I think that's fair in those situations. And yeah, I get the argument that, oh, but if Ilia beats Islam, that proves, and becomes the frickin', welterweight champion, that proves he was a legitimate challenger. And if you think there's any real shot of him doing that, should that not then be a fair defense for Ilia, or for Islam if he wins? And to that I would say, what makes it tricky is that it gets into a size dynamic that we see in MMA, which is that often a smaller guy can beat a bigger guy, and that bigger guy can beat the guy bigger than him, but at some point the smaller guy cannot beat the biggest guy. So, and we see that play out where think of Conor McGregor fighting Nate Diaz at welterweight. That's still giving an additional advantage to Nate Diaz because he's the bigger man of the two, and he'll fill out more if they're fighting up a weight class. And sure, Diaz has fought at welterweight, but he's clearly an actual lightweight, and you see that anytime he fights a wrestler at welterweight, and just gets ragdolled like in the Rory McDonald fight. And so McGregor, a former featherweight, is big enough to beat lightweight Nate Diaz, and he's even big enough to do it up a weight class at 170, but that win, and similarly his win over Donald Cerrone at 170, does not suggest that McGregor is big enough to fight actual welterweights. If he would have then gone on to fight Kamaru Usman or something, it wouldn't have gone well. And it's basically the same dynamic with Ilia and Islam. And bear in mind, I'm not picking Ilia to beat Islam. I wouldn't even pick him to beat him at lightweight. I think he has a better shot at lightweight because Islam wouldn't have as obnoxious of a size advantage. And yes, Ilia appears to be a generationally great fighter. He has a unique skill package. He has some paths to victory against Islam. But if you saw my prediction vid for JDM, for Islam versus JDM, I basically said I'm not picking anyone to beat the top guys from Team Khabib unless their name is Merab, okay? And that includes Ilia, unfortunately. But in any case, like, let's just take the given, though, that Ilia, is, even if you're not picking him, he has a real shot, and let's say he beats Islam. He might be able to beat Islam, who's naturally a weight class above, because Ilia is naturally a featherweight, Islam's naturally a lightweight, and he could even potentially beat him at the higher weight class that Islam is now fighting at. He could be a featherweight beating a lightweight at welterweight. And he could be big enough as a featherweight to do that. And Islam himself, as a big lightweight, could be big enough to beat welterweights. As we saw him do that against JDM. He might be able to do that still against the other top contenders. That might be true. But that doesn't mean that Ilia is big enough to fight those welterweights. That does not mean Ilia is big enough to fight JDM, to fight Shavkat, to fight these guys, to fight Morales, because while there's a size gap that he's closing to fight Islam, and while there's a size gap that Islam's closing to fight those guys, the gap Ilia has to close to fight those guys is probably a bridge too far. And you really see this demonstrated when you just look at the sorts of MMA math, like chains of defeat that you can concoct. And if you were to actually believe, the conclusion of the first guy on the list can be beaten by the last guy on the list, no matter how much smaller he is, because the MMA math links them, it of course leads to absurdities. So a great one that I kind of laid out when I was talking to this guy in the comment section was Brock Lesnar, okay, humongous, giant, athletic heavyweight. Brock Lesnar lost to Frank Mir. Frank Mir lost to Fedor Emelianenko. Fedor Emelianenko lost to Dan Henderson. Dan Henderson lost to Jake Shields. Jake Shields lost to Jake Ellenberger. Jake Ellenberger lost to Jorge Masvidal. Jorge Masvidal lost to Gilbert Melendez. Gilbert Melendez lost to Edson Barboza. Edson Barboza lost to Dan Ige. Dan Ige lost to Patricio Pitbull. Patricio Pitbull lost to Sergio Pettis. And Sergio Pettis lost to Henry Cejudo. Of course, it does not follow that Henry Cejudo can beat Brock Lesnar. Okay, the first and last guys in that chain. Even though he beat the guy who beat the guy who beat the guy who beat the guy who beat Brock Lesnar, that does not mean he can beat Brock Lesnar. And we all get that. And this isn't... and the guy commenting on my video, this isn't a rebuttal to him. This is he gave me the idea for this topic because he was just throwing out the idea of whether Ilia would prove it was a fair and legitimate defense if he were to actually beat Islam. That's all he was saying. But in any case, you see by that example, if you take it to the extreme, reductio ad absurdum, if you take it that far, if Ilia can beat Islam and that proves he's a legitimate challenger at welterweight, you can take that even further and say, is Henry Cejudo a legitimate challenger for Brock Lesnar? Of course not. Even though he beat people who beat people who beat Brock, that's just not how this works. And the only way you could really prove that Ilia was a legitimate welterweight challenger, even with the win, would be for Ilia to then defend the belt. If Ilia went up, beat Islam at welterweight, stuck around, defended his belt against Gary, against Shavkat, against whomever, then that would be fair. Then it would be okay, Ilia's just a fucking legitimate welterweight, apparently, despite being undersized. Fair enough. He's just that good, and this was legitimate for Islam to defend against him as a welterweight champion. I just highly doubt that would happen. I think, even though I'm not picking Ilia to beat Islam, I would be even less confident in his ability to fight a big welterweight. Because again, the size gap would just be so obnoxious. And Ilia is not even big at lightweight. He doesn't even look that strong at lightweight. Like the physicality of Charles Oliveira, himself a former featherweight, but naturally a bigger dude than Ilia, seemed to trouble Ilia in their fight. So the idea that Shavkat, is going to fight Ilia seems a little absurd. It feels like a freak show from the Pride days more than a serious modern fight. And so, yeah, for all those reasons, like, I double down on what I said in my previous video, that as much as like Ilia versus Islam is this great fight we all want to see, for legitimacy and for GOAT status, I actually just want to see Islam defend against a welterweight. Now, if they could both defend, like if Ilia defends against anybody at lightweight, ideally Arman, and especially Arman. Like, if Ilia beats Arman, and if Islam beats any of the top contenders, if he beats Gary, if he beats Shavkat, if he beats Morales, if he beats any of those guys not named fucking Kamaru Usman, ideally, unless, Usman needs another win if we're going to, like, give him the old man title shot. But if Islam can defend his belt against one of the legitimate top contenders, and if Ilia can defend, especially if he can defend against Arman, then make the super fight. Then let Ilia go up, or Islam go back down if he wants to, but realistically let Ilia go up, and we'll see what happens. And, it'll be legitimate in the sense that, like, Islam defending against Volk was legitimate. But as it stands, if Islam with this win over JDM, which I argued in my last video was an incredibly amazing win, but has the downside of JDM still not being the clear top dude at welterweight. Because remember, Bilal beat Edwards, and that was great, although that win has aged very poorly, because Edwards has just gone on to get finished in his next two fights. Bilal had the win over Brady, which aged pretty well, of course, but and had the great win streak and deserved his title shot. But Bilal was also older. There was, Shavkat was the boogeyman in the division. When Bilal beat Edwards, a lot of people still questioned if Bilal was the best welterweight in the world. Not that he wasn't a legitimate champion, but just, you can be the champ and not be the best guy. And in fact, that's how champs lose their belt, is because whoever the contender is actually better. But in any case, people were questioning that for Bilal. And then JDM got a title shot that many people thought was undeserved. And he won, and that was great. It was a good fight. It was a legitimate win. But in any case, that leaves JDM in a spot where he's not the obvious best welterweight. Islam goes up and beats him, and that's great. And Islam's a legitimate champion, and that does wonders for his GOAT status. But it doesn't by itself actually prove to me that Islam's the best welterweight. I need to see him defend against one of the top contenders. And if instead of doing that, he defends against Ilia, a former featherweight, that's not a legitimate defense of his belt, in my view. It's a cool fight. It's a cool super fight. It would be a good win for Islam. It wouldn't do nothing for his legacy, but it would not legitimize his status as the top welterweight, which is what he should be doing if he wants to actually be the GOAT. So that's my thoughts on that. That's my thoughts on the dynamics of Ilia moving up to fight him, when that should and shouldn't happen, and how you can have these double standards where, one guy, it's a title eliminator for one guy and not the other, or where if this guy wins, it proves he's legit. If this guy loses, it proves he wasn't, kind of thing. And again, to reiterate, or to kind of restate my position more coherently, yes, there's a sense in which Ilia, by beating Islam, proves he's it doesn't prove he's a legitimate welterweight challenger. I'll put it that way. It doesn't prove he was a legitimate welterweight challenger. It just proves he's a legitimate foe for Islam, because he can even beat him at welterweight. But again, him beating Islam, while he'd technically win the belt, it would be even worse than what I was just saying about Islam beating JDM, where it would not be clear that Ilia is the top welterweight, or that he can even fight these other welterweights, because just because he can beat Islam, who can fight at least one of these welterweights in JDM, that does not show that Ilia can fight them. In much the same way that Conor beating Nate at 170 or beating Donald at 170 proved he could hang with Kamaru Usman and Robbie Lawler and all the other guys, Stephen Thompson, all the welterweights of that era. It didn't prove that either. And so that's how I'll restate my position as that, just to clear things up. But that's what I've got in that, and that's what I want to see. I want to see Islam not wait for the White House card. I want to see him fight either Gary if he beats Muhammad, or Shavkat if he's available, or Morales in a kind of worst case scenario. But I want to see him fight one of those guys in like late winter, early spring. That's what I want to see. And I want to see Ilia fight, ideally Armin if he beats Hooker, and if not, then, Patty or something. But I want to see that happen, and then if they both win, yeah, make the title fight. That'd be worth doing. So those are my thoughts.